Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to Drums and Drams. My name is Cameron, and tonight we're going to be taking a look at a very recent release coming to us from the Heaven Hill Distillery. This is Larceny Barrel Proof Batch A121. All right, so like I said, tonight we're going to be taking a look at the most recently released batch of Larceny Barrel Proof, batch A121. Now, the way this video is going to work is that I'm first going to nose and taste through this recent release and give you my overall thoughts, and then I'm going to compare it side by side to the previous 3 batches of Larceny Barrel Proof, just to see how all of these things stack up against each other. Now, I've got to say, before we get started here, Larceny Barrel Proof has traditionally not been one of those bourbons that I reach for all the time. It's been a pretty disappointing release for me personally. I know Whiskey Advocate gave batch B520 an award, and a lot of people seem to like that batch. I actually did a blind tasting of all 3 of these previous releases on a live stream just recently, and the results shocked me a little bit. A120 was my favorite, and I believe B520 and C920 were essentially tied at a much lower place than A120 was. I don't remember which one was in second, but the fact of the matter was A120 was my favorite batch, and that was a little bit shocking for me because of the hype that B520 received. But with all of that said, I just want to put that caveat on this video, that slight disclaimer that Larceny Barrel Proof has typically not been a very impressive release for me, and I know there are many fans of it out there. So what I'll say is that the way that I'm going to evaluate this new batch as compared to these previous batches is by really focusing on the 4 pours in front of me right now and not thinking about any other of my favorite barrel proof bourbons. No Elijah Craig Barrel Proof in my head, no Stag Juniors in my head. Focusing here and just seeing how they compare, not how I compare them to other things, if that makes sense. So let's go ahead and get into some stats here for this A121 release. It is worth noting that this is the lowest proof release of Larceny Barrel Proof yet. It is clocking in at 114.8 proof, which is 57.4% ABV. The other releases range between 61.1 and 61.6%, so this is about 4% lower ABV than the other releases. So we will see how that factors into the tasting here and how it compares. The final thing I'll say is, yes, my older 3 Larceny batches here have the googly eyes, and I forgot to put the googly eyes on A121 before the video started, so I'm very sorry about that. I will get right on it as soon as I am done recording this. I think that's all I have here, so let's go ahead and get right to it and start nosing Larceny A121. All right, so it's a light nose actually. I know this is barrel proof and all that good stuff, 57.4%, but it's a pretty light and pretty watery nose. First thing is just a nice dose of ethanol, and right behind that is some peanut brittle. These are the things that I don't like in these Larceny Barrel Proof releases, and it's the first thing that hits me up front, along with a very thin nose here. Yeah, right behind all of that, we're really talking about, like I said, a lighter nose, a lighter profile. So there's light caramel, I don't know, some light cane sugar notes, a little bit of light milk chocolate, just a smidge here on the nose. Yeah, it's got that like Snickers vibe, I guess, with the nuttiness, with the chocolate notes. Actually, a good bit of vanilla going on here, and I like to talk about vanilla, especially when we have like an ethanol forward nose like this one does. I like to talk about vanilla as interweaving with the ethanol. So the ethanol hits you up front, but when you go back for a second and a third nose, that ethanol sweetens up a little bit because there are some vanilla notes that sort of play well with that. So that's what I'm getting on this. Again, it's like this vanilla Snickers bar profile, a little bit of ethanol. It's not very eventful, not very rich and deep and heavy. It's very much on the surface. So let's check this out on the palate now, A121. One thing to remember before I talk about this. The first sip of bourbon for the night, especially if it's a barrel-proof bourbon, you got to be careful judging the bourbon on that first sip because it's going to smack you in the face and seem very intense. The one thing I will say is it's interesting that I got a little bit of medicinal cherry up front on this first sip. That's not something that I got on the nose, not something I expected. But for these other notes, let me take a second sip now that I'm sort of acclimated to the proof, to the profile, and let's see how this does on a more consistent second sip. So a little bit of that medicinal cherry still. We get some baking spice right up front, a nice amount of cinnamon and nutmeg, definite peanut brittle note right along with that baking spice. They kind of intermingle pretty well together. That transitions to the lighter caramel notes, that slight milk chocolate note in the mid palate. As we get into the finish here, there's only a very small hint of oak. It's very light as you chew on the palate a bit. But I will say the finish is pretty nice. It's a combination of those baking spices, the cinnamon, nutmeg, and the ethanol. It really hangs on in the back palate into the throat. And, you know, it's pleasant. It's a decent little Kentucky hug, I would say. So all in all, pretty thin profile here. Not crazy eventful. It's not rocking my world or anything like that. So I'm going to be curious to see how this compares to the other batches. Let me get a quick little sip of water here before we continue. Next thing we're going to do is check out C920 and how this compares to A121. Wow, that is a night and day difference. And I've got to say, C920 for me in my blind tasting didn't do very well, but right now, this is thick and rich and viscous and heavy and deep. It's a lot of good things that I want in a bourbon. And even though I'm trying to be very specific to these 4 pours and not think outside of them, not compare it to my other favorite barrel proof bourbons, this one smells pretty darn good, the C920. It is loaded with rich caramel flavors and you know, that butterscotch element. Really nice oak on the nose. One thing that I have gotten on the C920 before is like sort of an off-putting sawdust type note. I'm not getting that right now for whatever reason, but we'll see when we go to the palate how that fares. There's also a ton of dark cherry in this, which I love. The medicinal cherry that hit me in A121 on the palate is definitely different than this. This is a nicer, more pleasant sort of cherry cordial type note. So let's check this out on the palate, C920. Cheers. That is way, way thicker, more oily in the mouth. The proof here, like I said, these are sitting around 61%. This is 61.2. So 3.8% more than the A121. Just a night and day difference on the mouthfeel, on the experience, and the palate. It's just better. It's just richer and fuller. Those oak notes are much more pronounced, and even in the mid palate, before you even get to the finish, the oak is really there and really present. That dark cherry note, just really rich caramels and butterscotch. Let's do one more sip. All right, so that sawdust type note is starting to creep in just a little bit. Sort of a strange thing going on in there, but it's not off-putting enough for me to put this anywhere below the A121. There is a slight nuttiness to go along with that, but it's really reserved, again, compared to the A121. So C920 for me, a rich, viscous, full pour, and a pretty good experience, at least so far. So let's go ahead and move back another release to B520 and see how this thing compares. We'll check it out on the nose here first. Okay, so that is a peanut fest. Yeah. All right. As many of you know from watching some of my other videos, I am not a big fan of peanuts in my whiskey, unless it is a whiskey that is known for having peanuts in it. So Booker's is a great example. I enjoy Booker's. The 2020 releases were about as much peanut as I can possibly take in a whiskey, but it's still okay because that is what the Booker's profile has in it. When I think of a wheated bourbon like this, I don't think about peanuts and ethanol. I think about just different flavors. There's some oak funk that you get with a wheated whiskey that has some age to it. There are sweeter flavors, more unique butterscotch type flavors. And peanuts don't belong in there. B520 for me is all peanut on the nose. It's a little bit of a lighter profile than C920. Not as rich and heavy, but it's definitely heavier than the A121, which is like really, really thin. Let me do that comparison. Oh yeah, so B520 definitely on the nose, significantly better than A121. And even with the peanut, it's better, but not quite as good as C920. Let's try this on the palate. Yeah, same thing. Yeah, you could maybe convince me there's a little chocolate covered peanut in there, but it's a lot of just like vanilla peanut notes. Not a ton of oak going on in there either. Richer caramel than A121, but nothing as deep and rich as C920. B520 for me is a miss, and I've never understood why Whiskey Advocate, awarded this thing, why people hyped B520. Maybe it's because Elijah Craig B520 was a fan favorite, but Larceny B520 is definitely not for me. So I'm gonna go ahead and leave that. So far, A120 is very thin, ethanol peanut, slight medicinal cherry, just kind of middle of the road average. C920, deep, rich, the best one I've had so far, and at this point, B520 is slightly above the new release A121. So let's see how A120, our final pour of the night, can compare to these. Let's check it out on the nose. So that has got to be the most balanced nose so far. No, it is not as deep, it's not as rich as C920, but there is something else in here that is balancing this out in a different way. You know what it is? It's when I think about flavors and I think about aromas in my whiskey, I think about sort of a pyramid. And the top of the pyramid would be what I consider to be lighter flavors. And of course, it gets smaller as you get up there. So you want less light or bright flavors from me. And as you move down the pyramid, the bottom for me is typically oak, right? Like oak is that underlying layer to kind of support everything. Above oak might be, caramel, might be butterscotch. Above that might be some sort of fruitiness, perhaps like red fruits and things like that. Above that might be vanilla. The top of the pyramid might be like, I don't know, ethanol. For instance, that's like an example. A120 here for me has a sort of crisp green apple note that sits on the top of this. And that kind of has a top pyramid type flavor to me. And that's really nice. These others, the top most note, the brightest note is the peanut characteristic. And that's why it really stands out. But in this one, it's all balanced out by this sort of crisp green apple, sort of sourness, I guess, but it kind of intermingles with the caramel nicely as well, like a caramelized green apple. And that's what stands out to me in terms of the balance of A120. That's why this nose to me is stellar. It might even make more sense for a green apple note to be in a rye whiskey, and there's no rye in this, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, you get that green apple note. You get a very delicate balance of caramels, of vanillas, of oak. All of that is really playing nicely together. It's not as deep as C920. It's not as peanut forward as B520. And it's not as light as A121. It's almost the best of all of these worlds in terms of balance, even if it's not going to really wow your palate like C920 might because of its depth. So let's check out A120 here on the palate, the final pour of the night. Yeah, the peanut is there, but it's not so aggressive that it's off-putting. There's that sour green apple. There's some really nice dark cherry notes going on in there. Like I said, on the nose, a beautiful balance between caramel and oak. very supportive in the profile here. The ethanol is not so off-putting, and this is making a lot of sense to me now why I had this as my first place in my blind tasting. So let's go ahead and rank these things and tell you what I think overall. I think it's a toss-up here for first place. The A120 is so balanced, like I just talked about, but the C920 is so dark and rich and full of depth. I'm gonna say that they are a tie for first place, knowing that if you are looking for balance and a slightly lighter profile, A120. If you're looking for more depth and richness, C920. In third place, because those are a tie for first, we're gonna have B520, which is a peanut fest, but has some viscosity, has some mouthfeel, and some depth and oak, supporting. And in last place, the focus of this entire video is batch A121 because it's so darn thin. And when you thin out the profile because of the lower proof, all of those flavors get stripped away, but the ethanol remains, the peanut flavor remains, and it's just not very well supported. So unfortunately, the entire point of this video was to evaluate A121, and in my opinion, it is the worst Larceny barrel proof batch on the market so far. So if you're looking for Larceny barrel proof and there are options in your area for whatever reason, A120 or C920. Those are the directions I would go. I would not purchase B520 again. I would absolutely not even purchase for a first time A121 if I knew what this tasted like. I would go with A120 or C920. I know it's been a bit of a negative review. I apologize for that, but I want to give you my true and honest thoughts on this Larceny barrel proof lineup. I think there's a lot of room for improvement. I think honestly, we just need to get some older whiskey in here and a better blend to get rid of those peanut notes, get a little bit more age and a little more oak in there as these things continue getting older, as the barrels get older and everything. But right now, Larceny barrel proof for me is just not that impressive. And I'm gonna stand by that opinion, especially after doing this review for A121. So that's all I have for today. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, like this video. I know it was a little bit negative. Send me an email at drumsanddrams@gmail.com. If you have any whiskeys you would like me to review or samples to send in, you can find that in the description below. Find me on Instagram, find me on Facebook. And please remember that everything here is subjective. I'm just giving you my own opinion. You might agree or disagree, and if you do disagree and you want to post a comment and talk about it, just, please be respectful. I don't like the hate mail. I don't like the flaming on different videos and stuff like that. So let's have an open and inviting and honest discussion, but let's, please be respectful of each other. I think that's all I have for tonight's video. I'm so sad that I spent this money on A121 and it did not live up to the hype. So I'm going to end my night here with A120, the very first release of Larceny barrel proof and perhaps the most balanced of the bunch. So cheers, and I will see you next time here on Drums and Drams.